Piercing the roar of the Bitterroot Mountain blizzard, a frail whimper stopped Alora Caldwell dead in his tracks. It wasn't a trapped fox or a dying fawn, it was human. Peering through the snow-choked pines, the solitary mountain man's ice-blue eyes locked onto a tiny girl huddled in a drift, her lips blue and her dress frozen solid. As Alora reached down to scoop her into his massive, fur-clad arms, a trembling little hand pressed against his chest. "Please help my mama first," she begged, her voice barely surviving the gale. Alora braced himself to find a tragic victim of the ice. He didn't expect to find a bullet wound and a trail of fresh blood. The year was 1888, and the Wyoming Territory was an unforgiving master. For Alora Caldwell, the isolation of the high mountains was not a punishment, but a sanctuary. At 34, his face was weathered by sun and frost, lined by memories he preferred to leave buried beneath the permafrost. He was a mountain man in the truest sense, living off the land, trading pelts twice a year in the rough-and-tumble logging town of Oakhaven and speaking to no one unless absolute necessity demanded it. The morning the blizzard broke, Alora was running his trapline along the jagged ridge of the Sleeping Bear Incline. The snowfall had been relentless for 3 days, burying the world in a blinding, deceptive white. He was checking a snare when the faint, unnatural sound broke the monotonous howl of the wind. When Alora found the little girl, he estimated she couldn't be more than 6 years old. Her dark hair was matted with ice, and her pale blue eyes were wide with a terror that went far beyond the cold. She was pointing a shivering, frost-bitten finger toward a dense thicket of spruce trees at the bottom of a steep ravine. "Where is she, little bird?" Alora asked, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that had rusted from lack of use. "Down there," the girl whispered, her teeth chattering violently. "The bad men came. Mama told me to run and hide in the snow. I hid, but Mama didn't follow." Alora's chest tightened. Bad men. Up here, a bad man was worse than a starving grizzly. He unclasped his heavy bearskin coat, wrapping the child tightly in its profound warmth, leaving himself in just his heavy woolen shirt and leather suspenders. He tucked her into a hollowed-out nook beneath the roots of a giant pine, shielded from the wind. "You stay right here. Do not move. I'm going to get your mama." Alora drew his Winchester rifle from its scabbard on his back and began the treacherous descent into the ravine. The snow was waist-deep in places, treacherous and shifting. As he neared the bottom, the pristine white gave way to chaotic churns of mud, snow, and a horrifying amount of crimson. There, half buried beneath the splintered remains of a small, overturned buckboard wagon, lay a woman. Alora approached with the practiced silence of a predator, his eyes sweeping the tree line for any sign of the bad men. Seeing nothing but tracks rapidly filling with fresh snow, he knelt beside the woman. She was lying face down, her blonde hair fanned out across the bloody ice. He gently turned her over, and the breath caught in his throat. She was breathtakingly beautiful, even in her deathly pallor. Her cheekbones were sharp, her skin like porcelain, but it was marred by a deep, bruising gash across her temple. Yet, that was not the source of the blood. As Alora ran his hands over her freezing form to assess the damage, his fingers met a warm, wet hole in the heavy wool of her coat, just below her left shoulder blade. She had been shot. In the back. This was no accident. This was a hunt. Alora pressed his ear to her chest. Her heartbeat was there, a faint, erratic flutter like a trapped moth. She was bleeding out, and the cold was the only thing slowing the hemorrhage enough to keep her alive. "Hold on, lady," Alora muttered grimly. He tore a strip from his own woolen shirt, packing the entry wound as tightly as he dared, binding it with a leather strap from the ruined wagon to apply pressure. He didn't have time to investigate the wagon or track the riders. The woman had minutes, perhaps an hour, before the cold and blood loss claimed her entirely. With a grunt of exertion, Alora lifted her limp body into his arms. She weighed practically nothing, a fragile bird caught in a tempest. He carried her up the brutal incline, his muscles screaming against the weight and the biting cold. When he reached the giant pine, the little girl was exactly where he left her, clutching the bearskin coat around her tiny frame. Is she? The girl choked out, tears finally spilling down her frozen cheeks. She's alive, Alora said, though he wondered if he was making a promise he couldn't keep. What's your name, little one? Lily. She sniffled. All right, Lily. I'm Alora. My cabin isn't far. We have to move fast. Alora managed to fashion a makeshift drag sled using branches and his own snowshoes. He secured the unconscious woman onto it, wrapped her and Lily in his heavy bearskin, and began the grueling trek toward his cabin. Every step was a battle against the elements, the wind whipping his face with razor-sharp ice crystals. But the image of the woman's pale face and the terrified eyes of the little girl fueled a fire in his belly he hadn't felt in a decade. Someone had tried to execute this woman and leave her child to the wolves. Alora Caldwell was a man who minded his own business, but out here in the wild, the rules of civilization didn't apply. Out here, a man did what was right, or he wasn't a man at all. The heavy oak door of Alora's cabin slammed shut against the storm, plunging the interior into a welcome, dimly lit silence. The cabin was sturdy, built into the side of the mountain itself, smelling heavily of cured leather, wood smoke, and dried herbs. Alora wasted no time. He moved the woman, Lily's mama, onto his large bed near the stone hearth. He stoked the embers into a roaring fire, the flames casting dancing orange shadows across the log walls. Lily, come sit by the fire, Alora instructed gently, pulling up a heavy wooden rocking chair. Let the heat get into your bones. I need to tend to your mama. Lily obeyed silently, her large eyes fixed on her mother's still form. Alora fetched his medical kit, a scarred leather satchel containing a few surgical tools, bandages, needle and thread, and a bottle of strong rye whiskey. It wasn't much, but mountain men learned to be their own doctors, or died trying. He carefully cut away the blood-soaked wool of her coat and the tattered cotton dress beneath. The wound was ugly. The bullet had entered just below the scapula and, miraculously, had exited near her collarbone, missing the heart and lungs but tearing through a significant amount of muscle and vein. It went clean through. Alora muttered to himself, a small mercy. Still, the bleeding was severe, and the risk of infection in these conditions was a near-death sentence. He uncorked the whiskey. This is going to smell harsh, Lily, he warned the child without looking back. He poured a generous amount of the raw alcohol directly into the wound. The woman's body convulsed violently. A weak, agonizing groan tore from her pale lips, her eyes fluttering beneath their lids, but she didn't fully wake. Alora worked quickly, his large, calloused hands surprisingly steady. He threaded his needle with catgut and began the gruesome task of stitching the torn flesh. He packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow and Usnea Old Mountain remedies for bleeding and infection before binding her shoulder tightly in clean linen. When he finished, he washed the dried blood from her face and neck with a warm, damp cloth. Stripped of the blood and dirt, her features were striking. There was a stubborn set to her jaw, even in unconsciousness, a defiance that Alora recognized. It was the look of a survivor. For the next 48 hours, the cabin became a battleground against a raging fever. The woman tossed and turned, crying out in the throes of delirium. She fought invisible demons, her hands clawing at the thick wool blankets. No, Arthur, please. The child, she shrieked on the second night, her voice hoarse and broken. You can't have her. I'd rather die. Alora, sitting by the bed with a cool cloth, gently pinned her wrists to keep her from tearing her stitches. Hush now. You're safe, he murmured, his deep voice attempting to cut through her nightmares. Arthur isn't here. Arthur. The name stuck in Alora's mind. During the day, while the woman slept fitfully, Alora tended to Lily. The little girl was resilient. Warmed by the fire and fed with hearty venison stew, Color returned to her cheeks. She watched Alora with a
This story
quiet,
was posted on the
observant
channel The Rusty
intelligence.
Saddle.
"Are
Please
you an
do not
outlaw,
repost it in any
Mr.
form.
Alora?" Lily asked one afternoon, tracing a knot in the wooden floorboards with her toe. Alora paused in the middle of cleaning his rifle. He looked at the girl, a ghost of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "No, Lily. I'm just a man who prefers the company of trees over people. Mama says outlaws hide in the mountains, but she also said we had to hide." Lily frowned, trying to make sense of the adult world. "Are we outlaws?" "No," Alora said softly, setting the rifle down. "I reckon your mama is running from something much worse than the law." He walked over to his heavy oak table, where he had laid out the few items he had recovered from their person: a cracked pocket watch, a few silver dollars, and a heavy, silver-plated money clip that he had found in the pocket of the woman's ruined coat. Alora picked up the money clip, rubbing his thumb over the intricate engraving. It bore the initials A.P., intertwined with the brand of a longhorn steer. Alora knew that brand. Anyone who lived within 500 miles of the Wyoming border knew that brand. The Iron Cross Ranch. A cold dread pooled in Alora's stomach, heavier than the winter freeze outside. The Iron Cross was owned by Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton wasn't just a cattle baron. He was a ruthless tyrant who owned judges, sheriffs, and enough hired guns to start a small war. If this woman was running from Pendleton, she had brought the devil himself to Alora's doorstep. He looked back at the woman sleeping on his bed. The stakes had just shifted. This wasn't a rescue anymore. This was a siege waiting to happen. Alora walked to the heavy wooden shutters, unlatching one to peer out into the blinding white. The storm was finally breaking, the wind dying down to a low moan. The snow would hide their tracks for now, but men like Arthur Pendleton didn't stop hunting. They paid trackers who could read a snapped twig under 2 feet of snow. Alora closed the shutter and locked it tight. He moved to the hearth, picking up his whetstone and his hunting knife. He began to drag the steel across the stone, shk, a steady, rhythmic promise of violence. If Pendleton's men came up this mountain, they were going to find out that there were things in the wild far more dangerous than the cold. It was the morning of the 4th day when the fever finally broke. Alora was at the stove, brewing a bitter chicory coffee, when he heard the rustle of sheets. He turned to see her sitting up, her chest heaving, her eyes wide and panicked as they darted around the unfamiliar cabin. She gripped the blanket tight to her chest, wincing sharply as the movement pulled at her stitched shoulder. "Lily," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm here, Mama." Lily, who had been playing with a carved wooden bear Alora had given her, scrambled up onto the foot of the bed. The woman let out a choked sob, pulling the girl to her uninjured side, burying her face in her daughter's hair. "Oh, thank God. Thank God." Alora remained by the stove, giving them a moment. He poured a tin cup of water, added a small drop of willow bark extract for the pain, and walked slowly toward the bed. He stopped a respectful distance away. "You shouldn't move too sudden," Alora said, his low voice filling the room. "Tore you up pretty good. The stitches are fresh." The woman's head snapped up. She looked at Alora, at his towering frame, his thick beard, the scarred leather of his vest, and the heavy revolver strapped to his hip. Fear flashed in her eyes, sharp and instinctive. "Who are you?" she demanded, pulling Lily closer. "Where are we?" "My name is Alora Caldwell. You're in my cabin, up near the Sleeping Bear Ridge. Found you in the snow a few days back. Your little girl guided me to you." He offered the tin cup. "Drink this. It'll help the fire in your shoulder." She hesitated, her eyes analyzing him, searching for deceit. Finally, thirst won. She took the cup with a trembling hand and drank deeply. "Thank you," she rasped, handing it back. I remember the snow. I remember the shot." She closed her eyes, a shudder running through her. "My name is Artemisia Montgomery." Alora noted the surname. "Montgomery. not Pendleton. Well, Artemisia Montgomery, Alora said, pulling up the rocking chair and sitting down. You lost a lot of blood. You're lucky the cold slowed it down, and luckier still that bullet didn't hit bone. But we have a problem. Artemisia stiffened. I don't have any money to pay you, Mr. Caldwell, but as soon as I can walk, we'll leave. We won't be a burden. You're in no shape to walk to the outhouse, let alone off this mountain, Alora said bluntly. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the silver money clip, and tossed it onto the quilt. It landed with a heavy, dull thud. You might be Artemisia Montgomery now, but the man who put a bullet in your back goes by Arthur Pendleton. Am I right? All the color drained from Artemisia's face. She stared at the money clip as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. Her breathing grew shallow and rapid. Where did you get that? Found it in your coat pocket. I recognized the brand. Alora leaned forward, his ice blue eyes piercing hers. I don't care about your past, Artemisia. I ain't a lawman, and I ain't a bounty hunter. But if I'm harboring a woman hunted by the Iron Cross, I need to know what kind of war is coming to my front door. Tears welled in Artemisia's eyes, overflowing and tracking down her pale cheeks. The dam broke, and the exhaustion of running finally consumed her. He's my husband, Artemisia confessed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Or, he was. I took back my maiden name the day I ran. Alora didn't interrupt. He just listened. Arthur is. He's a monster, she continued, her voice trembling with a mixture of hatred and terror. To this world, he's a respectable businessman, a builder of the West. Behind closed doors, he's cruel. He demands absolute obedience. When I couldn't give him a son, only Lily, his cruelty turned to violence. She absently rubbed her wrist, as if feeling an old ghost of a bruise. A month ago, I found out he was planning to send Lily away to an institution back east. He said she was weak, a distraction. He wanted to start over with a new wife, but his pride wouldn't allow for a divorce. He told me I would have an accident on the stairs. Alora's jaw clenched. His knuckles went white as he gripped the armrests of his chair. So, I stole from his safe, Artemisia said, lifting her chin with a defiant spark. I took enough gold to start over in California. I took that money clip to prove to myself I had taken a piece of his power. We ran in the dead of night. We made it clear across Wyoming and into Idaho before his trackers caught up with us. They ambushed the wagon. I told Lily to run into the trees. I tried to lead them away, and then I felt the fire in my back. The cabin was silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. Alora looked at Lily, who was sitting quietly, understanding far more than a child her age ever should. He won't stop, Mr. Caldwell, Artemisia said, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. Arthur won't let the insult stand. He won't let his property go. His men will follow our tracks. They will find this cabin. You have to let us go, or they'll kill you too. Alora stood up slowly. He walked over to the window, staring out at the frozen expanse. The snow had stopped falling. The sky was a hard, crystal blue, perfect weather for tracking. For 10 years, Alora had run from his own ghosts. He had retreated to the mountains to avoid the pain of loss, to avoid the complications of human connection. He had convinced himself that a man alone was a safe man. But looking at Artemisia, battered but fiercely protective, and little Lily, he felt a dormant part of his soul roar back to life. He turned back to face Artemisia. There's a choke point about 2 miles down the ridge, Alora said, his voice terrifyingly calm. Steep walls, deep snow. Only one way up to this cabin. A man with a good rifle could hold off 10 riders there, easy. Artemisia stared at him, bewildered. What are you saying? I'm saying you're not going anywhere, Artemisia Montgomery, Alora said. Walking back over and retrieving his Winchester, he checked the action, the metallic clack-clack echoing loudly in the small room. Pendleton's men might be good at terrorizing women in the dark, but they are out of their element up here. This is my mountain. He met Artemisia's
This
eyes,
story was
and
posted
for
on the
the first
channel The
time in a
Rusty
decade,
Saddle. Please do
Alora
not
Caldwell
repost it
meant
in any
every
form.
word he said. They come for you, they have to go through me. And I promise you, lady, I don't bleed easy. Before the sun had even crested the jagged peaks of the Bitterroots, Alora was preparing for war. He moved about the cabin with a frightening, silent efficiency, pulling boxes of 44-40 cartridges from a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. He loaded his Winchester, checked the action on his Colt Peacemaker, and slipped a long, serrated hunting knife into his boot. Artemisia watched him from the bed, her face pale but her eyes sharp. The fever had completely broken, leaving her weak but lucid. Lily was asleep, curled into a tight ball beneath the heavy bearskin. "You don't have to do this, Alora," Artemisia said, her voice strained. She gripped the quilt, her knuckles white. "You could point us down the north slope. We could take our chances in the timber. If Arthur's men find you here." "The north slope is a graveyard of hidden ravines and weak ice," Alora interrupted, not unkindly, but with absolute finality. He walked over to the heavy oak table and picked up a double-barreled shotgun, laying a handful of buckshot shells beside it. "And Pendleton didn't send ordinary ranch hands. He sent trackers, men who get paid by the scalp. You and the girl wouldn't make it 5 miles. He walked over to the bed, setting the shotgun and the shells on the mattress beside her. "I've loaded both barrels," Alora instructed, his ice-blue eyes locking onto hers. "It kicks like a stubborn mule, so you brace the stock against your good shoulder. If anyone comes through that door and it ain't me, you don't ask questions. You pull both triggers. You understand?" Artemisia looked at the weapon, then up at the mountain man. She swallowed hard, a fierce determination hardening her delicate features. "I understand." Alora nodded. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it until you hear me whistle the Yellow Rose of Texas. 2 short, 1 long." With that, he stepped out into the freezing dawn, the heavy door thudding shut behind him. He heard the heavy iron bar slide into place. Good. The cold was a physical weight, but Alora ignored it. He strapped on his snowshoes and began the rapid descent toward the choke point, a narrow, treacherous pass known locally as Dead Man's Narrows. High rock walls flanked a trail, no wider than 2 horses abreast, currently buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. It was a natural bottleneck. By the time the sun was fully up, casting blinding reflections off the snowpack, Alora was positioned behind a massive deadfall of pine logs 50 yards up the eastern slope. He had a perfect vantage point. He didn't have to wait long. Around mid-morning, the crunch of snow and the heavy breathing of horses echoed up the canyon. Alora peered through the scope of his Winchester. 4 riders were fighting their way up the trail. They were bundled in heavy canvas and furs, their mounts struggling, chest deep in the drifts. Alora recognized the man in the lead instantly, and a cold knot formed in his stomach. It wasn't just a hired gun. It was Jebediah Preacher Stone. Preacher Stone was a notorious tracker and bounty hunter from the Dakota Territories, a man who read the Bible to his bounties before he shot them. He wore a distinctive bowler hat incongruous with the wild frontier and carried a custom Sharps buffalo rifle that could take a man's head off at 1,000 yards. Pendleton had spared no expense. Alora waited. Patience was the primary weapon of a hunter. He let them get deep into the narrows until the sheer rock walls hemmed them in completely. Crack. Alora didn't aim for a man. He aimed for the rock face directly above the trailing rider. The .44 caliber slug shattered the granite, sending a shower of razor-sharp stone and ice raining down on the rear horse. The animal shrieked, rearing up in blind panic and throwing its rider into the deep snow. The sudden movement in the confined space caused a chain reaction. The other horses began to thrash. "Sniper! Up the ridge!" Preacher Stone bellowed, diving from his saddle and dragging his Sharps rifle with him behind a boulder. Before the thrown rider could stand, Alora fired again. The bullet bit into the snow, inches from the man's face, a clear warning. "Turn back, Stone." Alora's voice boomed down the canyon, amplified by the rock walls. "This mountain is closed." "Alora Caldwell?" Stone's voice echoed back, laced with dark amusement. "I thought you died in a ditch in Abilene? The boss is offering $500 for the woman, Caldwell. Hand her over, and we ride away." "You know I can't do that, preacher." One of Stone's men, a young hothead with a scarred cheek, peeked around his horse to take a shot. Alora squeezed the trigger. The bullet shattered the man's collarbone. He dropped with a scream, clutching his shoulder as his blood stained the pristine snow. "Damn it!" Stone roared. "Covering fire!" The canyon erupted. The two remaining able-bodied men unleashed a hail of lead up the ridge. Wood splintered around Alora's head, and rock chips flew like shrapnel. He ducked low, pressing his face into the snow. Suddenly, a deafening boom ripped through the air. The heavy slug from Stone's buffalo rifle punched straight through the upper portion of Alora's log cover, tearing a chunk of wood the size of a fist and sending it flying. A jagged splinter caught Alora just above the ribs, tearing through his heavy coat and sinking deep into his side. Alora grunted, pain flaring hot and bright. He clamped a gloved hand over the wound, feeling the warm, sticky flow of blood. He had underestimated the penetrating power of the sharps. He couldn't stay pinned down. Pulling a stick of dynamite from his satchel stolen years ago from a Union Pacific rail crew, he struck a match against a dry stone, lit the short fuse, and hurled it high over the deadfall. It landed on the snow-covered slope, directly above the riders. The explosion was magnificent. It wasn't the blast that did the damage, but the shockwave. The heavy, unstable snowpack on the canyon wall fractured. With a sound like tearing canvas, a localized avalanche let loose, tons of white powder and ice cascading down into the narrows. Alora watched as Stone and his men scrambled in terror, abandoning their pinned horses and dragging their wounded comrade back down the trail as the snow buried the pass, effectively sealing the route. The choke point held, but as Alora stood, a wave of dizzying nausea hit him. He looked down at his side. The blood was flowing freely now, soaking his shirt. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over, and he had a long, agonizing walk back to the cabin. The heavy oak door groaned as Alora pushed it open, stumbling over the threshold. The warmth of the cabin hit him like a physical blow, making his head spin. He barely had time to slide the iron bar into place before his legs gave out. He collapsed heavily against the rough-hewn wall, his breathing ragged. Alora. Artemisia was out of bed in an instant, heedless of her own throbbing shoulder. Lily gasped from the corner, dropping her wooden bear. Artemisia rushed to him, her bare feet slapping against the floorboards. She knelt beside his massive frame, her eyes widening at the dark crimson stain spreading across his left side. "You're shot," she breathed, her hands hovering over him, terrified to cause him more pain. "Splinter," Alora rasped, his eyes squeezing shut. "Buffalo rifle, blew the log apart. Piece of wood the size of a railroad spike, stuck in my ribs." "Lily, fetch the whiskey from the table. The water too, quickly," Artemisia commanded. The panic in her voice was gone, replaced by the same steely resolve that had driven her to steal from Arthur Pendleton. She helped Alora strip off his heavy, blood-soaked coat and the ruined woolen shirt beneath it. The wound was ugly. A jagged piece of pine, thick as a thumb, was embedded deeply in the muscle over his lower ribs. Alora looked at her, his vision swimming. He saw the sweat beading on her forehead, the way she favored her stitched shoulder, yet pushed through her own agony to save him. "You shouldn't be out of bed," he muttered. "Shut up, Mr. Caldwell," Artemisia said. Her tone brooked no argument. "You saved my life. It's my turn." She poured the whiskey over the wound, and Alora bit down on his leather glove to stifle a roar of pain. His body arched off the floorboards. Artemisia didn't flinch. She grasped the bloody splinter with a pair of iron forceps from his kit. "On three," she said softly. "One, two." She yanked on two. Alora nearly blacked out as the wood tore free. He lay panting,
This story was
staring
posted
at
on the
ceiling
channel The
rafters,
Rusty
while
Saddle.
Artemisia
Please do not
expertly
repost
packed
it
the
in any
wound with
form.
yarrow and bound his ribs tight with clean linen strips. Her hands were gentle, her touch surprisingly tender for a woman running for her life. With Artemisia supporting his uninjured side, they managed to get him into the bed he had vacated for her. She pulled the rocking chair close, refusing to leave his side as the afternoon waned into evening. Fever set in quickly. The splinter had dragged dirty bark and coat fibers deep into the muscle. Alora tossed and turned, trapped in the same delirious cycle Artemisia had been in days prior. "No, no, let them pass," Alora muttered in the dark, his hands twitching. "The train is gone. The money's gone." Artemisia bathed his forehead with a cool cloth. "Hush, Alora. You're in the mountains. You're safe. Pinkertons don't fail," he argued with a ghost, his eyes darting beneath closed lids. I told them the bridge was rigged." "Sarah. God, Sarah, I'm sorry." Artemisia froze, the damp cloth hovering over his brow. She listened, piecing together the fragmented confessions of a broken man. Alora Caldwell wasn't just a trapper. He had been a Pinkerton detective, a man of the law who had seen the law corrupted. And Sarah, a wife, a sister, whoever she was, the loss of her had driven him to this freezing exile. Around midnight, his fever broke, leaving him drenched in sweat, but coherent. He opened his eyes to find Artemisia asleep in the rocking chair, her head resting near his hip on the mattress. The firelight played across her features, softening the sharp edges of her exhaustion. He moved slightly, and she jolted awake. "You're awake?" she whispered, a profound relief washing over her face. "How is the pain?" "Like I got kicked by a draft horse," Alora rasped, managing a weak, crooked smile. "But I'm alive." "Thank you, Artemisia." She poured him a cup of water, helping him lift his head to drink. "You were talking in your sleep," she said softly, sitting back down. "About a train. About Pinkertons. And someone named Sarah." Alora closed his eyes, a shadow crossing his face. For a long time, the only sound was the crackle of the hearth. "Sarah was my wife," he finally said, his voice heavy with the rust of old grief. 10 years ago, I was a senior agent for the Pinkerton Detective Agency in Denver. We were tracking a gang that hit the Union Pacific line. I had an informant. I thought I had it all figured out." He took a shaky breath. "It was a setup. The gang knew we were coming. They bypassed the train and hit the agency office instead. Sarah was there, bringing me dinner." Artemisia covered her mouth, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I couldn't protect her," Alora whispered, staring into the flames. "The law couldn't bring her back. So I walked away. Came up here where the only predators are wolves and bears. They don't lie. They just kill you to eat." Artemisia reached out, her small, warm hand resting over his large, calloused one. "Arthur used to tell me that the world is just wolves and sheep," she said quietly. "He thought he was the biggest wolf. But he was wrong. Alora, you aren't a wolf. You're a sheepdog. You protect the flock. You protected Lily. You protected me." Alora looked at her hand, feeling a strange, terrifying warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the fever. He turned his hand over, intertwining his fingers with hers. For a moment, there was peace in the cabin, two battered souls finding a fleeting sanctuary in the storm. But the mountains are unforgiving, and peace never lasts. Just as dawn began to turn the windows gray, a sound rolled up the valley. It wasn't the wind. It was a heavy, rhythmic thumping, followed by a series of sharp, echoing blasts that rattled the tin cups on the shelves. Boom! Boom! Alora sat up, wincing as his ribs protested. The color drained from Artemisia's face. "Dynamite," Alora said, his grip on her hand tightening. "They aren't digging through that avalanche. They're blowing it clear." Pendleton hadn't given up. He had brought a small army, and they were blasting the mountain to pieces to get to her. The mountain trembled. Each blast of dynamite echoed like the judgment of the Almighty, rattling the mortar in the cabin's stone chimney. Alora dragged himself from the bed, his face a pale mask of sheer willpower. The crude stitches in his side screamed in protest. But the Pinkerton training that had lain dormant for a decade took over, cold and precise. "Artemisia, get Lily into the root cellar," Alora ordered, his voice brooking no argument. He pointed to a heavy iron ring set flush into the floorboards near the hearth. "Take the shotgun. Do not come up until I tell you." Artemisia's hands shook as she grabbed the double-barreled shotgun, but her eyes were dry. She hoisted the trap door, the smell of damp earth and root vegetables wafting up. She ushered a terrified Lily down the wooden rungs, then looked back at Alora. "Arthur won't leave witnesses," Artemisia said, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "If he kills you—" "He won't," Alora lied, checking the cylinder of his Colt Peacemaker. "Get down. Now." The trapdoor shut with a heavy thud. Alora dragged the heavy oak table over it, concealing the entrance. He then moved to the gun loop, a narrow slit he had built into the thick log walls precisely for a siege. He waited. An hour passed in agonizing silence. The blasting had stopped. Then, the crunch of snow. Through the narrow slit, Alora saw them crest the final ridge. There were 8 men left. They rode slowly, their horses blowing white steam into the freezing air. At the center of the formation rode Arthur Pendleton. Even clad in a heavy beaver pelt coat, Pendleton exuded an aura of cruel authority. He was a handsome man, with a silver-streaked beard and cold, aristocratic features, but his eyes were entirely dead. Beside him rode a man with a tin star pinned to his canvas coat, Sheriff Josiah Miller of Oakhaven, bought and paid for by Iron Cross money. But it was the man riding on Arthur's left that made Alora's blood run cold. He was a lean, rat-faced man missing half his left ear. Harlan Boggs. Alora's breath hitched, a phantom pain flaring in his chest that had nothing to do with the wood splinter he'd taken yesterday. Harlan Boggs was the informant, the man who had sold out the Pinkertons 10 years ago, the man who had told the rail gang exactly where Sarah would be waiting. "Caldwell." Arthur Pendleton's voice boomed across the clearing, dripping with false civility. "I know you're in there. I am a reasonable man. I have Sheriff Miller here with a lawful warrant for the arrest of Artemisia Montgomery for grand larceny and the kidnapping of my legal heir. Send them out, and I will compensate you handsomely for your trouble. $5,000 in minted gold." Alora shoved the barrel of his Winchester through the gun loop. "That warrant ain't worth the ink it's printed on. Pendleton, you have no jurisdiction up here." Pendleton sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. "I was afraid you'd be a romantic, Caldwell." "Harlan?" "Burn him out." Harlan Boggs dismounted, pulling a bundle of pitch-soaked rags and a kerosene lantern from his saddlebags. He smirked, the scarred tissue of his missing ear twisting grotesquely. "With pleasure, boss." "Harlan Boggs," Alora roared through the timber. "You stepped into the wrong jurisdiction 10 years ago, and you just stepped onto the wrong mountain today." Boggs froze, squinting at the cabin. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Caldwell? The Pinkerton? Boss? That's the dead man from Denver." "I don't care if he's the ghost of Abraham Lincoln," Pendleton snapped, drawing a silver-plated revolver. "Light the fire!" Boggs struck a match. Alora didn't hesitate. He sighted down the Winchester, ignoring the searing pain in his ribs. He didn't aim for Boggs. He aimed for the kerosene lantern in the man's hand. Crack. The bullet shattered the glass. The kerosene exploded outward in a brilliant, violent fireball, igniting the pitch-soaked rags and Boggs's heavy canvas coat simultaneously. Boggs screamed, dropping to the snow and thrashing wildly as the flames engulfed him. The clearing erupted into chaos. Sheriff Miller's horse reared, throwing the corrupt lawman into a snowdrift.
This story was posted on the channel The Rusty Saddle. Please do not repost it in any form.
Thick log walls of the cabin. Wood splintered and glass shattered as Alora ducked beneath the window frame. "Spread out! Surround the cabin!" Pendleton roared, his horse dancing nervously as he fired blindly at the structure. Alora crawled across the floor, leaving a smear of fresh blood on the planks. He reached the back window, kicking open the heavy wooden shutter. Two of Pendleton's men were slogging through the deep snow, trying to flank him. Alora took a breath, steadied his trembling hands, and fired twice. The Winchester barked, the sharp reports echoing off the mountain peaks. Both men dropped, their bodies sinking into the white drifts, leaving only dark, blossoming stains behind. But the sheer volume of incoming fire was overwhelming. A bullet punched through the door, grazing Alora's thigh. He grunted, dragging himself back behind the cast-iron stove. He was out of rifle ammunition, bleeding from 2 wounds, and Arthur Pendleton was practically on his porch. "It's over, Caldwell." Arthur Pendleton's voice was no longer the smooth baritone of a wealthy cattle baron. It was ragged, stripped of its aristocratic veneer by the freezing wind and the unexpected resistance. The heavy, thudding footsteps of his remaining men stomped onto the wooden planks of the porch, the sound vibrating through the floorboards right into Alora's bones. "Break the damn door down. Leave nothing breathing." Alora crouched behind the cast-iron stove, his breathing shallow and wet. Every intake of air felt like a jagged knife, twisting into his ribs where the wooden shrapnel had pierced him. Blood had soaked through Artemisia's makeshift bandages, warm and sticky against his skin, pooling steadily on the rough-hewn floor. He looked at the heavy oak table he had dragged over the cellar trapdoor. Beneath that wood, beneath the earth, Artemisia and Lily were trapped in suffocating darkness. If Pendleton's men breached the cabin and Alora fell, those 2 innocent souls would be dragged back to a life worse than death or slaughtered right here in the dirt. 2. Thwack. The head of a felling axe bit viciously into the thick oak door. The heavy timber groaned, a long splinter of wood flying inward and clattering against the stone hearth. Thwack. The iron hinges squealed under the immense strain. Alora knew the door wouldn't hold a third strike. He drew his Colt peacemaker, the heavy steel, a familiar, comforting weight in his trembling hand. He pulled back the hammer with a definitive, metallic click. The Pinkerton training that he had tried to drown in a decade of mountain whiskey and isolation came rushing back. A trapped animal waits to be slaughtered. A predator attacks the breach. With a roar that tore at his stitched side, a primal sound of pure defiance, Alora shoved himself off the floor. He lunged toward the entrance, throwing his heavy shoulder against the thick iron latch and hauling the door inward a fraction of a second before the axeman could swing again. The sudden, violent opening caught the 2 men on the porch completely off guard. The axeman, a burly brute in a buffalo coat, stumbled forward into the threshold, off balance. Alora didn't hesitate. He brought the heavy barrel of the Colt down across the bridge of the man's nose with a sickening crunch. The man crumpled instantly, dead to the world before he hit the floorboards. The second hired gun, a younger man with panic in his eyes, fumbled to raise his lever-action rifle. Alora stepped into the freezing wind, wrapping his large left hand around the rifle's barrel and shoving it forcefully upward. As the gun discharged harmlessly into the porch roof, Alora pivoted, driving his boot squarely into the man's chest and sending him tumbling backward over the wooden railing to land hard in the deep, blinding snowdrifts below. Alora stepped fully out onto the porch. The freezing air hit his sweat-drenched body like a sheet of ice, but it cleared his fading vision. Arthur Pendleton sat on his massive black gelding 20 yards away across the blood-stained clearing. The cattle baron's silver-plated revolver was drawn, aimed squarely at Alora's chest. To Pendleton's right, Sheriff Josiah Miller was desperately trying to control his dancing horse, his double-barreled shotgun trembling violently in his... Behind them, the smoldering remains of Harlan Boggs lay dark against the pristine snow. "You are a remarkably stubborn fool, Caldwell," Pendleton sneered. The Baron's eyes flicked down to the dark crimson stain covering the entire left side of Alora's shirt. "Look at you. You're bleeding out on your own porch. You have 30 seconds of life left in you. Where is my wife?" "She isn't your wife," Alora spat, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the howling wind. "She took back the name Montgomery the day she realized she married a coward who beats women. And she isn't here." "A pathetic lie," Pendleton said smoothly, though a muscle feathered in his jaw. He cocked his silver revolver. "Miller, put a slug in his belly. Let him die slow while I tear this cabin apart plank by plank." Sheriff Miller raised his shotgun, his face a pale, sickly shade of gray beneath the brim of his hat. He was sweating despite the bitter cold, his eyes darting between Alora and the dead men littering the yard. "Josiah Miller," Alora barked. He didn't raise his voice to a shout, but the sheer, commanding authority in his tone made the corrupt lawman flinch. "You pull that trigger, and you sign your own federal death warrant. You think Arthur Pendleton's cattle money is going to save you from the rope?" Miller hesitated, his finger pausing on the trigger. "What the hell are you talking about, mountain man? You're a nobody." "I ain't just a mountain man. And you know it now." Alora bluffed, his ice-blue eyes locking onto the sheriff with predatory intensity. He leaned into his old life, using real names to build an impenetrable lie. "Harlan Boggs recognized me before he burned. I was a senior agent under William A. Pinkerton himself. You think I came up to this ridge and didn't keep my wires open? I sent a telegraph to Cheyenne 3 days ago, before the storm buried the pass. U.S. Marshal Frank Hadsell is already riding hard for Oakhaven." Miller's eyes widened in sheer terror. Marshal Hadsell was a legend in the territory, a ruthless, incorruptible lawman who had hanged a dozen corrupt deputies the previous year. "They have the ledgers, Miller." Alora continued relentlessly, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that carried across the snow. "They have the banknotes. They know exactly how much Iron Cross blood money went into your pockets to look the other way. You ride away right now. You ride hard for the Dakota border. And maybe you only get 20 years in a federal penitentiary. You shoot me, you shoot a former federal agent, and Hadsell will see you hang from the tallest oak in town square." It was a complete, desperate fabrication born of Pinkerton interrogation tactics. But Josiah Miller didn't know that. The mention of Hadsell, combined with the sheer carnage Alora had unleashed single-handedly, drained the last ounce of false courage from the sheriff's heart. I ain't dying for your domestic disputes, Arthur," Miller stammered, his voice cracking. He lowered the shotgun, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. He hauled back on his horse's reins. "I didn't sign up to fight the federal marshals." "Coward," Pendleton screamed, his aristocratic veneer completely shattering into pure, ugly, unadulterated rage. His face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. He violently swung his silver revolver away from Alora and aimed it directly at Miller's back, intending to execute the fleeing man for his betrayal. It was the 1 second of distraction Alora needed. Alora raised the heavy Colt Peacemaker, aligning the iron sights with Pendleton's chest. But as he flexed his arm, a sudden, agonizing cramp seized his injured side. His core muscles, severed and bleeding, simply gave out. His arm dropped a crucial fraction of an inch, just as his finger squeezed the trigger. The blast echoed like thunder. The heavy, .45 caliber slug missed Pendleton's heart, but shattered the cattle baron's collarbone, spinning him violently in the saddle. Pendleton shrieked a high, reedy sound of absolute agony. He dropped his silver revolver, the expensive weapon vanishing into the deep snow. His massive black gelding, panicked by the deafening gunfire and the sudden stench of fresh blood, reared up on its hind legs. With a terrified whinny, The horse bolted toward the tree line, dragging the screaming, bleeding cattle baron with it into the frozen wilderness. The younger hired gun, who had managed to crawl out of the snowdrift, watched his boss flee, and the sheriff desert. He looked up at the towering, blood-soaked mountain man on the porch, slowly, carefully. The young man tossed his rifle into the snow and raised his empty hands in surrender, turning and running down the mountain without looking back. Alora stood alone on the porch, the smoking Colt heavy in his hand. The silence that rushed back into the clearing was deafening, broken only by the whistling wind. He had done it. Against impossible odds, the choke point had held. Slowly, the adrenaline that had kept him upright evaporated, replaced by a crushing, cold emptiness. Alora's knees buckled. He collapsed heavily onto the rough planks of the porch.
This story was posted on the channel The Rusty Saddle. Please do not repost it in any form.
Snow-laden sky above him began to spin lazily, growing dark around the edges. Then, the sound of scraping wood. The heavy table was being pushed aside. Alora forced his eyes open as the cabin door swung wider. Artemisia was there, her dress stained with dirt and soot, her face pale but fiercely beautiful. Lily was right behind her, her small hands clutching her mother's skirt. "Alora!" Artemisia screamed, dropping to her knees on the blood-slicked wood. Warm, frantic hands pressed against his freezing face. Tears streamed down her cheeks, falling like hot rain onto his skin. "Alora, stay with me! Don't you close your eyes. They're gone," Alora whispered. It took every ounce of his remaining strength to form the words. A weak, genuine smile touched his cracked lips. He reached up with a trembling, blood-stained hand, his fingers gently brushing a stray lock of blonde hair behind her ear. "The wolf is gone, Artemisia. You saved us." She wept openly, pressing her forehead against his chest, completely heedless of the blood ruining her dress. She gripped his heavy canvas coat as if she could anchor his soul to the earth by sheer force of will. "You saved my little girl." "No," Alora murmured, his eyes finally closing as a profound, healing exhaustion washed over him. He felt Lily's small hands gripping his knee, felt Artemisia's frantic, beautiful heartbeat against his own fading one. "You brought me back to the world, Artemisia. You saved me." For the first time in 10 long, bitter years, Alora Caldwell didn't see the violent ghosts of his past when he closed his eyes. Surrounded by the scent of pine, gun smoke, and the tears of the woman he had fought for, he only saw a future. The legend of the shootout at Sleeping Bear Ridge became a whispered tale in the Wyoming Territory, a story of a solitary mountain man who stood down a cattle empire. Arthur Pendleton did not survive his wounds. He succumbed to infection in a freezing line shack days later, his iron grip on the territory dying with him. The corrupt Sheriff Miller fled east, never to be seen in Oakhaven again. But the truest part of the story was never told in the saloons. It lived quietly in a sturdy cabin high in the Bitterroot Mountains. Alora Caldwell stopped hiding from the world. He traded his traps for a small herd of cattle, building a life from the rugged earth alongside a woman who had taught him how to fight for the living, rather than mourning the dead. Little Lily grew up strong, the daughter of the mountains, forever protected by the man who had answered a whisper in the bitter snow. Ultimately, the harshest winter of Alora's life had blossomed into his greatest spring.